Let's begin by reminding ourselves of this graph, which shows the trends in incarcerated population, state and federal prison population. This begins in 1925 and goes up to 2017. It's from the Sentencing Project. And as you can see, in 1925 through the 70s, the total prison population remains fairly steady. And then we get a huge spike, a huge carceral explosion that peaks in 2007, 2008. Since then, a slight drop off, but still egregious numbers. Now, of course, this is with the huge caveat in mind that this excludes a lot of persons that are still caught up in the carceral net, parole, probation, or some kind of formal police monitoring, which exceeds 7 million. Not to mention the many ways that all of us are surveilled and policed in our everyday lives. But let's just stay with this number here. Now, here's another interesting graph that I found, upsetting but interesting, where if we continue these trends, the population will go down, but one of the goals by certain activist groups, including the ACLU and Just Leadership USA, is to try to reduce the prison population by 50% in the next 15 years. But if we continue with these trends, it will decline, but it will not decrease by 50% until 2091. That's 72 years. So it's a pretty daunting task, given all the current trends. And all of this, of course, while this carceral explosion occurred, while crime rates were overall dropping and still downward trending overall. So the question we're asking is, what happened? Why this exponential spike? And why did the prison become the central way in which we think about responding to harm, the central consequence of transgressions of law, when for most of human history, most of American history, this was not the case? If you remember, in fact, in the early 20th century, many European criminologists, other countries would come to the U.S. to look at ways of establishing a system of punishment that was humane and efficient. And then after the 70s, we get this huge explosion, which makes us, even though we have 5% of the world's population, we incarcerate 25% of the world's people. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the question of what are the factors that contributed to this carceral explosion. But first, let's be reminded of some overall trends. If you remember, several weeks ago, I handed out a sheet about various policies and actions that happened in the late 18th century at the so-called birth of our country, through the early 19th century, which was the birth of the prison. So the way that I frame that narrative, and of course, as with all narratives, especially historical narratives, there is a kind of imposition of a certain story that one wants to tell. It's not wholly arbitrary. I mean, these are facts, these are dates, these are events. But when one tries to extract that narrative through line or have some kind of hermeneutic or attempt to extract meaning, there are things that are excluded, there are choices that are made, which may problematize the narrative. But nonetheless, these are the dots that we're connecting to lead up to where we started the course, which was with Attica, the Attica prison uprising. So let's kind of go back a little bit. Now I'm going to follow what the New York Times has recently done by marking the year 1619 as an important moment in U.S. history. Most history books you do in high school, or even in college, and the common discourse marks the birth of our country, of course, 1776, right? The Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. But we have to be cognizant of those dates and those histories that are often repressed or marginalized or forgotten. So let's remind ourselves of the year 1619, which was when the first ship arrived in Port Comfort, Virginia, carrying 20 to 30 enslaved Africans. Of course, a lot of the way that this country became the so-called city upon the hill, a lot of this rhetoric that made America the kind of beacon of democracy, the beacon of hope, or the American dream, and all of those kinds of things, is because of the fact of enslaved labor and a form of incarceration that pre-existed the formal institution of the prison, but was nonetheless the horrible stain on the birth of this country that stays with us and is at the center of the issue we're dealing with, the incarceration crisis. So 1619, let's begin. We begin in that dark moment of enslavement, of colonialism, and that's something that ought be made more central to whatever it is that this American identity is. Now, the narrative that I tried to construct was one called Enlightenment and Shadows. So one of the ways we think about the birth of this country is it is a product, if not the product, of the so-called Enlightenment. Now, remember, the Enlightenment was a period of time in the 18th century where, out of the Renaissance, well, before you had the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, and then this period of Enlightenment where the idea was that we would use reason and the sciences and a universal morality and sense of justice that included more people that we looked at, like Kant or Bentham, and their theories of morality that also informed their theories of punishment, that was trying to make rules of morality and rules of justice that weren't grounded in the arbitrary will of a despot, a monarch, a pope, or some kind of hierarchical, patriarchal way of structuring morality in society. And so the idea that using reason to get at these objective or moral rules of conduct, rules of that guide legislation, that we could have something more fair, more just, more universal, more democratic, all of these things. Of course, the American Revolution and the French Revolution are marked as moments of resisting this hierarchy, this patriarchy, this monarchy, and giving more people access to the political process. And that's not wholly untrue. But with that Enlightenment, there was always a shadow that was cast, always embedded in that, in the documents, in the practices, in the language, some kind of exclusion. So while you get an expansion of rights, you also get a contraction of rights. While you get an inclusion of people in the democratic process, you also get an exclusion. So there was always, in making a law, there always also is a definition of the criminal or the enemy. And you also had different ways of expanding democracy, but also accumulating and ossifying wealth and power in more of a concentrated person or group of persons. So the way I want to tell this story, leading back up to where we are, at the beginning of the carceral explosion is to mark these moments of enlightenment, but also mark these moments of shadow.